again, that'll make this situation better. But I do have a message for our community, for our city, and I have a message for ICE. To ICE, get the fuck.
Okay, so we are watching a full-blown constitutional crisis unfold in real time right now, and this one is absolutely massive. The Trump administration's immigration and customs enforcement agents are heading into Minnesota to conduct what they're calling large-scale deportation operations, but here's the problem. The governor of Minnesota just authorized the state's National Guard to actively confront and block federal ICE agents if they try to execute these raids. This is not a drill. We are talking about armed state military forces potentially facing off against armed federal law enforcement agents on American soil. This is the kind of scenario that constitutional scholars have warned about for decades, the kind of thing that could fundamentally redefine the balance of power between the federal government and the states, and it's happening right now in 2026 as Trump doubles down on his immigration agenda heading into the midterm elections. This is not just about immigration policy anymore. This is about whether a governor can deploy military force to resist federal law enforcement, whether the president can federalize a state's National Guard against the governor's will, and whether we're about to see armed conflict between state and federal forces for the first time since the Civil Rights era, or possibly even the Civil War itself. The legal implications are staggering, the political stakes are astronomical, and the potential for this to spiral completely out of control is very, very real. Now, before we get into the details of what's actually happening on the ground in Minnesota, and what the legal framework says about all of this, I need to tell you something important. You can't really trust mainstream media anymore. They're either going to downplay this as just another partisan fight, or they're going to sensationalize it without giving you the actual constitutional context you need to understand what's at stake here. That's exactly why we built US Power Alert, to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. We break down these massive institutional conflicts so you can actually understand what's happening to American democracy and the balance of power in this country. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines and get analysis that goes deeper than the surface-level coverage you see everywhere else, make sure you subscribe to the channel right now. We bring the news straight to you every single day, and we do it without the corporate filters and the partisan spin that you get from traditional media outlets. Just hit the subscribe button below to join us, and if you want to support this work and be part of a community that truly cares about the truth and about understanding how power actually works in America, this is your moment. Subscribe right now. We're building something different here, and we need people like you who are willing to look past the headlines and understand the deeper forces that are shaping American politics. All right, let's get back to the video.
Any further help from the federal government. To Donald Trump and Kristi Noem, you've done enough. There's nothing more important than Minnesotan safety. I've issued a warning order to prepare the Minnesota National Guard. We have soldiers in training and prepared to be deployed if necessary. I remind you, a warning order is a heads up for folks. And these National Guard troops are our National Guard troops. They're teachers in your community, they're business owners, they're construction professionals. They are Minnesotans. Minnesota will not allow our community to be used as a prop in a national political fight. We will not take the bait. We do not need any further help from the federal government.
Here's what happened. The Trump administration announced about a week ago that ICE would be conducting what they called enhanced enforcement operations in several sanctuary jurisdictions across the country, and Minnesota was explicitly named as one of the primary targets. The administration has been pushing this hardline immigration agenda since Trump took office in January 2025, and by early 2026, they've ramped it up significantly. We're talking about operations that could involve hundreds of ICE agents moving into Minneapolis, St. Paul, and other cities across Minnesota to arrest and deport undocumented immigrants, including people who have been living in the United States for decades, people with American children, people with jobs and community ties. The administration says this is about enforcing federal immigration law and restoring order to what they call lawless sanctuary cities. But here's where things get complicated. Minnesota's governor, who is a Democrat and has been one of the most vocal critics of Trump's immigration policies, held a press conference 3 days ago and announced that he was authorizing the Minnesota National Guard to deploy to locations across the state where ICE operations are expected to take place. And he didn't just say they would be there to observe or to provide support to local communities. He explicitly said that the Guard would be authorized to intervene if ICE agents attempt to conduct raids that the state believes violate the constitutional rights of Minnesota residents or that threaten public safety. He used very specific language. He said the National Guard would be there to protect the people of Minnesota from what he called federal overreach and unconstitutional enforcement actions. Now, let's be very clear about what this means. The governor of Minnesota is essentially saying that his state's military force will physically block federal law enforcement agents from carrying out their duties. This is not symbolic. The Minnesota National Guard is a military organization. They are trained soldiers. They carry weapons. And the governor has made it clear that they are authorized to use the resources at their disposal to prevent ICE from conducting these operations. The White House immediately pushed back, and Trump himself went on social media and said that the governor of Minnesota is in open rebellion against the federal government, that he is obstructing justice, and that if the Minnesota National Guard interferes with federal law enforcement, the president will federalize the Guard and place them under federal command. Trump also suggested that he might deploy active duty military forces to Minnesota if necessary to ensure that federal law is enforced. So now we have a situation where both sides are essentially threatening to use military force. The state is threatening to use its National Guard to block ICE. And the federal government is threatening to either federalize that guard or deploy federal troops to override the state. This is a constitutional nightmare, and it's playing out in real time right now. And here's where this gets even more complicated. ICE has already moved hundreds of agents into staging areas near the Minnesota border, and they're reportedly planning to begin operations within the next few days. The Minnesota National Guard has deployed units to several locations in the Twin Cities and has established what they're calling protective perimeters around certain neighborhoods and community centers where ICE is expected to operate. So we're not talking about a hypothetical future confrontation. We are talking about armed state and federal forces that are already on the ground, already in position, and already preparing for a potential face-off. Local law enforcement in Minneapolis and St. Paul have said they will not assist ICE in these operations, which is their right under sanctuary city policies. But now the question is, what happens when ICE shows up and finds National Guard troops blocking their access? Do the federal agents back down? Does the National Guard let them through? Or do we end up with an armed standoff on the streets of an American city? And if that happens, who has the authority to resolve it? Does the president order federal forces to advance, regardless of the Guard's presence? Does the governor order his troops to hold their ground? And if both sides refuse to back down, what happens next? The legal framework here is incredibly complex, and it's not at all clear who has the upper hand. Let's start with the federal government's perspective. The Trump administration is arguing that immigration enforcement is a core federal function, that the Constitution gives the federal government exclusive authority over immigration and naturalization, and that states cannot interfere with federal officers who are carrying out their lawful duties. They're citing the Supremacy Clause of the Constitution, which says that federal law is the supreme law of the land, and that state laws and state actions cannot override or obstruct federal law. They're also pointing to a whole body of case law that says states cannot nullify federal law or prevent federal officers from enforcing federal statutes. From the administration's point of view, what Minnesota is doing is essentially nullification. It's a state trying to block the enforcement of federal law, and that is categorically unconstitutional. The administration is also pointing out that the president has the authority under federal law to federalize a state's National Guard if the Guard is being used to obstruct federal law enforcement. There's a specific statute that allows the president to call a state's National Guard into federal service. And once that happens, the Guard is no longer under the control of the governor. It's under the control of the president and the Department of Defense. So Trump's argument is that if Minnesota tries to use its Guard to block ICE, he'll simply federalize the Guard and take control of it, and then those same troops will be under federal command and will have no choice but to stand down or even assist federal operations. But Minnesota's argument is also rooted in serious constitutional principles, and it's not just political posturing. The governor is arguing that the state has a duty to protect its residents from what he believes are unconstitutional actions by the federal government. He's pointing to the 10th Amendment, which reserves to the states all powers not explicitly granted to the federal government, and he's arguing that the state has a police power, a fundamental authority to protect the health, safety, and welfare of its people. He's also arguing that many of the ICE operations that are planned involve tactics that violate the Fourth Amendment rights of Minnesota residents, things like warrantless home raids, racial profiling, and detentions without probable cause. The governor's saying that if ICE is going to violate people's constitutional rights, then the state has not just the right but the obligation to step in and protect those rights. He's also pointing to the Posse Comitatus Act, which is a federal law that generally prohibits the use of federal military forces for domestic law enforcement. Now, ICE agents are not military, they're civilian law enforcement, so Posse Comitatus doesn't directly apply to them. But the governor is making a broader point, which is that if Trump tries to deploy active-duty military forces to Minnesota to enforce immigration law, that would be a clear violation of Posse Comitatus, and the state would have every right to resist it. The governor is also arguing that the president's threat to federalize the National Guard is itself an abuse of power, because the federalization authority is supposed to be used in very specific circumstances, like when a state is unable or unwilling to suppress an insurrection or enforce federal court orders, as happened during the Civil Rights Movement when presidents federalized state guards to enforce desegregation orders. But in this case, Minnesota is not in a state of insurrection, there's no federal court order being defied, and the governor is arguing that using federalization as a tool to override a state's legitimate exercise of its police powers would be a gross abuse of presidential authority. So you can see the problem here. Both sides have constitutional arguments. Both sides have legal precedents they can point to. And both sides are dug in. Neither is willing to back down. The Trump administration sees this as a test case for whether the federal government can effectively enforce immigration law in the face of state resistance. And they know that if they back down in Minnesota, every other sanctuary state is going to take note and is going to be emboldened to resist federal enforcement in the same way. So from Trump's perspective, he has to win this fight. He has to establish that the federal government's authority is supreme and that states cannot block federal law enforcement. But from Minnesota's perspective, this is about protecting their residents from what they see as an authoritarian overreach by a president who is using immigration enforcement as a pretext to expand executive power and to intimidate and terrorize vulnerable communities. The governor knows that if he backs down now, it sends a message that states have no power to resist federal actions, even when those actions are unconstitutional or abusive. So both sides see this as an existential fight, and that's what makes it so dangerous. Now, let's talk about what happens if this actually turns into a physical confrontation, because that's the scenario that everyone is trying to avoid, but that is becoming increasingly likely. If ICE agents arrive at a location in Minnesota and find National Guard troops blocking their access, the federal agents have a few options. They can try to negotiate with the Guard commander on the ground and convince them to stand down. They can call back to Washington and ask for guidance. They can attempt to go around the Guard and access the location from a different angle. Or they can try to push through the Guard's perimeter, which is where things could get very dangerous very quickly. If federal agents try to physically push past National Guard troops, the Guard has to make a decision. Do they use force to stop the agents? Do they detain the agents? Do they let them through? And if the Guard does use force, even just to physically block the agents, that could be considered an assault on federal officers, which is a federal crime. But if the Guard doesn't use force, then the whole point of deploying them is moot. They're just standing there, watching as ICE conducts its operations. So the Guard is in an impossible position. They're being ordered by their governor to block federal agents, but if they actually do that, they could be committing a crime, and they could be setting off a violent confrontation that no one wants. And then there's the question of what Trump does if the Guard does block ICE. If the president decides to federalize the Minnesota National Guard, that's a process that takes time. He has to issue an order through the Department of Defense, the Guard has to be officially called into federal service, and there has to be a transfer of command authority. That could take hours or even days. And in the meantime, what happens on the ground? Does ICE just wait? Do they try to operate anyway? And what if the Guard, even after being federalized, refuses to follow federal orders. That's unlikely, because once the Guard is federalized, the troops are subject to military law, and refusing orders would be insubordination or even mutiny. But there's also a scenario where individual Guard members, particularly those who are sympathetic to the state's position, might resign rather than follow federal orders to assist in deportations or to stand down while ICE operates. That would create chaos within the Guard itself, and it would turn this into not just a legal and political crisis, but also a military discipline crisis. And then there's the nuclear option, which is Trump deploying active-duty federal troops to Minnesota. If Trump decides that federalizing the Guard isn't enough, or if he wants to send a stronger message, he could order active-duty military units to deploy to Minnesota to ensure that ICE can operate without interference. The legal authority for this is murky. The Insurrection Act is the main statute that allows the president to deploy active-duty troops for domestic law enforcement, but it's supposed to be used only in very limited circumstances, like when there's an insurrection, a rebellion, or a situation where local authorities cannot or will not enforce federal law. The administration would argue that Minnesota's use of the National Guard to block federal law enforcement constitutes exactly that kind of situation, that the state is in rebellion against federal authority, and that the president has no choice but to deploy federal troops to restore order. But critics would argue, and they're right, that this would be a massive expansion of presidential power, that it would be using the military to enforce immigration policy in a way that violates both the Posse Comitatus Act and the fundamental principle that the military should not be used for domestic law enforcement, except in the most extreme emergencies. If Trump does deploy active-duty troops to Minnesota, we would be in completely uncharted territory. There would almost certainly be immediate legal challenges, probably emergency motions filed in federal court to block the deployment. There would be massive protests, not just in Minnesota but across the country. And there would be enormous pressure on Congress to intervene, either by passing legislation to restrict the president's use of the military, or even by initiating impeachment proceedings if they believe the president is acting unconstitutionally. Okay, let's break down what this actually means, because the implications here are so much bigger than just one immigration enforcement operation in one state. First, understand that this is fundamentally a fight about federalism, about the balance of power between the federal government and the states. The American constitutional system is built on the idea that the federal government has certain defined powers and that all other powers are reserved to the states. Immigration enforcement is clearly a federal power. No one disputes that. But the states also have police powers, the authority to protect the health, safety, and welfare of their residents. And when those two powers come into conflict, when the federal government is trying to enforce federal law in a way that a state believes violates its residents' rights or threatens public safety, who wins? The traditional answer, based on the Supremacy Clause, is that federal law wins. But that answer assumes that the federal government is acting within its constitutional authority. If the federal government is acting unconstitutionally, if ICE is violating people's Fourth Amendment rights, or if the president is abusing his authority, then does the state have the right to resist? Minnesota is saying yes. The state has not just the right, but the duty to resist unconstitutional federal actions. The Trump administration is saying no. States cannot second-guess federal law enforcement and cannot interfere with federal officers even if the state believes those officers are acting improperly. This is a question that the Supreme Court has never fully resolved, and we might be about to get an answer in the most dramatic way possible. Second, this is about executive power and the limits of presidential authority. Trump has consistently pushed the boundaries of presidential power, whether it's on immigration, on executive orders, on emergency declarations, or on his use of federal law enforcement and the military. And every time he does it, there's a question of whether he's gone too far, whether he's exceeded his constitutional authority. In this case, the question is whether the president can use federal law enforcement and potentially the military to override state governments that are trying to protect their residents from what they see as unconstitutional federal actions. If Trump wins this fight, if he's able to federalize the Minnesota National Guard or deploy active duty troops and successfully carry out these ICE operations despite state resistance, it sets a precedent that future presidents can use the same tactics. It means that any president who wants to enforce federal law in a state can simply override state objections by federalizing the state's own military or by deploying federal troops. That's a huge expansion of presidential power, and it fundamentally shifts the balance of federalism in favor of the executive branch. But if Minnesota wins, if the state is able to successfully block ICE operations using the National Guard, or if the courts step in and say that Trump cannot federalize the Guard or deploy troops in this situation, then it sets a precedent that states have real power to resist federal overreach. It means that federalism is not just a theory, it's a practical check on federal power, and it gives states a tool to protect their residents from federal actions they believe are unconstitutional. Third, this has enormous political implications, especially heading into the 2026 midterms, which are now just months away. Trump and the Republican Party have made immigration enforcement one of their central issues, and they've been hammering the message that Democrats are soft on immigration, that sanctuary cities are lawless, and that the federal government needs to take aggressive action to enforce immigration law and secure the border. This confrontation in Minnesota plays right into that narrative. Trump can point to Minnesota and say, look, this is what happens when Democrats control state governments. They actively obstruct federal law enforcement. They protect illegal immigrants at the expense of law-abiding citizens, and they're willing to use military force to block the federal government from doing its job. That's a powerful political message, and it's exactly the kind of thing that energizes Trump's base and could help Republicans in the midterms. But it's also incredibly risky for Trump, because if this turns into an actual violent confrontation, if there's a standoff, or, God forbid, if shots are fired and people are killed, that would be a disaster for Trump politically. The images of federal agents and state guard troops facing off, or of military forces being deployed to an American city to enforce immigration law, could backfire spectacularly. It could be seen as authoritarian, as an abuse of power, as exactly the kind of federal overreach that conservatives use to oppose. And it could mobilize Democratic voters and independents who are horrified by the idea of the president using the military against a state government. For Democrats, this is also a high-stakes moment. If Minnesota backs down, if the governor orders the National Guard to stand aside and lets ICE operate, it makes Democrats look weak. It makes it look like their opposition to Trump's immigration policies is all talk and no action. But if Minnesota holds firm, if the state actually blocks ICE operations and forces Trump to either back down or escalate to federalization or troop deployment, it could be a huge political win for Democrats. It shows that Democratic governors are willing to fight for their values and protect their residents, and it puts Trump in the position of having to decide whether he's really willing to go to the extreme of federalizing a state's guard or deploying federal troops just to carry out immigration raids. Either way, this becomes one of the defining issues of the 2026 midterms, and it's going to shape how voters think about executive power, federalism, immigration, and the role of state governments in resisting federal actions they see as unjust. Fourth, let's talk about the practical implications on the ground in Minnesota. These ICE operations are supposed to target undocumented immigrants, but the reality is that large-scale enforcement actions like this always have spillover effects. When ICE floods a city with agents and starts conducting raids, everyone in immigrant communities feels the impact, not just people who are undocumented, people with legal status, people who are citizens but who have undocumented family members, people who just look like they might be immigrants. All of these people become fearful. They stop going to work. They keep their kids home from school. They avoid public places. They're afraid to call the police or access public services. The economic impact can be significant because immigrant communities in cities like Minneapolis and St. Paul are major contributors to the local economy. They work in restaurants, in construction, in healthcare, in all kinds of industries. If those workers disappear, either because they're deported or because they're too afraid to leave their homes, businesses suffer, the economy takes a hit, and the entire community feels the effects. There's also the public safety question. If immigrants are afraid to interact with local law enforcement because they're worried about being reported to ICE, then crimes go unreported, witnesses don't come forward, and public safety suffers. This is why a lot of cities have sanctuary policies in the first place, not because they want to protect criminals, but because they want to maintain trust between immigrant communities and local law enforcement so that everyone, regardless of immigration status, feels safe reporting crimes and cooperating with police. And then there's the human cost. We're talking about families being torn apart, about people who have lived in the United States for 10, 20, 30 years, being arrested and deported to countries they barely remember. We're talking about children who are American citizens watching their parents being taken away by federal agents. We're talking about people losing their jobs, their homes, their entire lives. The administration says these are people who broke the law by entering or staying in the country illegally, and that the law has to be enforced. But the reality is that immigration law in the United States is incredibly complicated, and a lot of people who are undocumented are in that situation through no fault of their own. They came here as children, or they came here legally and their visas expired, or they applied for legal status and are stuck in a backlog that can take decades. And even if you believe that people who are here illegally should be deported, the question is how you do it, whether you do it in a way that respects people's rights and minimizes harm, or whether you do it through aggressive raids that terrorize entire communities. Minnesota is saying that the Trump administration's approach is the wrong way, that it's inhumane, that it's unconstitutional, and that the state has a responsibility to protect its residents from that kind of enforcement. The federal government is saying that states don't get to pick and choose which federal laws they'll enforce and which ones they'll obstruct, and that if you let states start blocking immigration enforcement, you're essentially creating a patchwork system where federal law means different things in different states. And that's not how the Constitution works. Fifth, let's think about the legal battles that are going to come out of this, because this is absolutely going to end up in court, probably very quickly. If the Trump administration moves forward with federalizing the Minnesota National Guard or deploying federal troops, Minnesota will immediately file a lawsuit in federal court seeking an injunction to block those actions. The state will argue that the president is exceeding his constitutional authority, that he's abusing the federalization power, and that he's violating the Posse Comitatus Act and other statutes that limit the use of military force for domestic law enforcement. The case would probably go to a federal district judge first, and there would be a hearing on whether to grant a temporary restraining order or a preliminary injunction to stop the federal actions while the case is being litigated. If the judge grants the injunction, that would be a huge victory for Minnesota, because it would mean the federal government can't proceed with federalization or troop deployment until the courts have fully resolved the case, which could take months or even years. But if the judge denies the injunction and says the federal government can proceed, then Minnesota would appeal to the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals and potentially to the Supreme Court. This case could move incredibly fast because everyone understands that the situation on the ground is urgent and that you can't just let this play out over months while ICE agents and National Guard troops are facing off in the streets. And then there's the question of what legal theory the courts would use to resolve this. There's really no clear precedent for a situation where a state uses its National Guard to physically block federal law enforcement agents from carrying out their duties. The closest historical analogies are from the Civil Rights era, when Southern governors used their state guards to resist federal desegregation orders. And in those cases, the federal government won. The presidents federalized the guards and enforced the court orders. But those cases involved states defying federal court orders, which is different from what's happening here, where Minnesota is saying that the federal government itself is acting unconstitutionally. Another analogy might be the nullification crises of the 19th century, when South Carolina tried to nullify federal tariff laws, and when southern states tried to nullify federal authority in the lead-up to the Civil War. In those cases, the federal government also won, and the principle was established that states cannot nullify federal law. But again, Minnesota would argue that this is different, that they're not trying to nullify federal immigration law, they're trying to protect their residents from unconstitutional enforcement actions. And that's a legitimate exercise of state police power. The courts are going to have to decide whether Minnesota's actions are a legitimate exercise of state authority or whether they're an unconstitutional obstruction of federal law. And whatever they decide is going to have huge implications, not just for this case, but for federalism and executive power more broadly. Sixth, think about the international implications of this, because what happens in Minnesota is going to be watched very closely by allies and adversaries around the world. When you have the President of the United States potentially federalizing a state's National Guard, or deploying active duty troops to enforce immigration law against the wishes of a state government, that sends a message about American democracy and about the stability of American institutions. Allies in Europe and Asia who are already concerned about Trump's approach to democracy and the rule of law are going to see this as another warning sign, another indication that the United States under Trump is moving in an authoritarian direction. Adversaries like Russia and China are going to use this as propaganda. They're going to point to the scenes of federal and state forces facing off and say, look, this is American democracy. This is what happens when a president abuses his power, and this is why the American system is failing. And it's not just about perception. It's also about the practical reality that when the United States is dealing with internal constitutional crises like this, it's less able to focus on foreign policy and national security challenges. If the Trump administration is consumed with fighting battles against state governments at home, that means they have less bandwidth to deal with China, Russia, Iran, or any of the other major challenges facing the United States abroad. So this internal fight over immigration enforcement and federalism has real consequences for America's position in the world and for the credibility of American democracy as a model for other countries. Seventh, let's talk about what this means for other sanctuary states and cities. Minnesota is not the only jurisdiction that has sanctuary policies or that has been resisting Trump's immigration enforcement agenda. You have states like California, New York, Illinois, and you have major cities like Los Angeles, New York City, Chicago, all of which have said they will not cooperate with ICE and will protect their immigrant residents. If Trump is able to successfully override Minnesota's resistance, whether by federalizing the Guard or by deploying federal troops or by some other means, then every other sanctuary jurisdiction is going to face the same threat. The message will be, either you cooperate with federal immigration enforcement, or the federal government will come in and force you to comply, using military force if necessary. That would be a fundamental change in the relationship between the federal government and state and local governments. And it would essentially mean the end of sanctuary policies as we know them. But if Minnesota is able to hold firm and either block the federal government's actions or win in court, then that emboldens every other sanctuary jurisdiction to do the same thing. It tells them that states have real power to resist federal overreach, and it gives them a playbook for how to do it. You could see governors in California, New York, and other states saying, if Minnesota can deploy its National Guard to block ICE, we can do the same thing. And suddenly you have a nationwide resistance movement with states using their military forces to obstruct federal law enforcement. That would be an enormous escalation of the conflict between Trump and sanctuary jurisdictions, and it would push the country even closer to a full-scale constitutional crisis over federalism and executive power. Eighth, there's the question of what happens to the individuals who are targeted by these ICE operations. If ICE is able to proceed with these raids despite Minnesota's resistance, you're going to have hundreds or potentially thousands of people arrested and put into deportation proceedings. Those people have legal rights. They have the right to hearings before immigration judges, the right to legal representation, the right to appeal. But the immigration court system is already overwhelmed. There's a backlog of more than 1 million cases, and wait times for hearings can be years. So even if someone is arrested in these raids, they might sit in detention for months or years before they even get a hearing. And a lot of people, especially people who don't have access to good lawyers, end up waiving their right to a hearing and accepting deportation just because they can't stand being in detention anymore. They need to get back to their families, even if it means being deported. The human rights implications of all of this are staggering, and there are going to be organizations like the ACLU, immigrant rights groups, human rights organizations. All of them are going to be filing lawsuits, challenging the legality of the raids, the detention conditions, the deportation procedures, all of it. Those legal challenges could tie up the system for years, and they could result in some of these deportations being reversed or people being allowed to return to the United States if the courts find that their rights were violated. But in the meantime, lives are being destroyed, families are being separated, and communities are being torn apart. Ninth, let's think about the broader trajectory of the Trump administration and what this tells us about where things are headed. This confrontation with Minnesota is not an isolated incident. It's part of a pattern where Trump is consistently testing the limits of presidential power and where states, courts, and other institutions are pushing back. We've seen this with executive orders on immigration, with emergency declarations, with attempts to withhold federal funding from sanctuary cities, with all kinds of actions where Trump has tried to expand executive authority and where other branches and levels of government have tried to check him. And every time there's one of these confrontations, the stakes get higher. the conflict gets more intense, and the potential for a serious constitutional crisis gets greater. If Trump wins this fight with Minnesota, it's going to embolden him to push even harder, to be even more aggressive in asserting executive power. If he loses, it's going to frustrate him, and we know from experience that when Trump is frustrated, he tends to lash out and try to find other ways to achieve his goals, sometimes in ways that are even more problematic. So, regardless of how this specific confrontation ends, the broader trend is toward more conflict, more institutional breakdown, and more serious challenges to the constitutional order. And that should worry everyone, regardless of your views on immigration or on Trump, because when you have a situation where the federal government and state governments are literally deploying military forces against each other, that's a sign that the system is under enormous strain, and that the norms and institutions that have held American democracy together for more than 2 centuries are being tested in ways they haven't been tested in a very long time. 10th, there's the question of what Congress does, because Congress has a role to play here, even though it's not clear they're going to play it. Congress has the power to pass legislation that could restrict the president's ability to federalize state national guards or deploy active duty troops for domestic law enforcement. They could amend the Insurrection Act. They could strengthen the Posse Comitatus Act. They could pass laws that give states more power to resist federal actions they believe are unconstitutional. They could also hold hearings. They could investigate the administration's immigration enforcement tactics. They could bring in witnesses from ICE, from the military, from the Justice Department, and ask tough questions about what's happening and whether it's legal and appropriate. But the problem is that Congress is deeply divided, and Republicans control the House, and Democrats control the Senate, or vice versa, depending on the outcome of the 2024 elections. And so, it's very hard to get any kind of bipartisan consensus on anything related to Trump or immigration. Republicans are generally going to support Trump's immigration enforcement efforts, even if they have private concerns about the tactics, because they don't want to be seen as going against the president, and because immigration is such a core issue for their base. Democrats are going to oppose what Trump is doing, they're going to call for investigations and hearings, but they don't have the votes to actually pass legislation or to force any kind of accountability unless some Republicans join them. So Congress is likely to be largely paralyzed on this. They'll make a lot of noise. There will be hearings and press conferences and strongly worded statements. But in terms of actually doing something to resolve the crisis or to check presidential power, it's not clear they're going to be able to act. And then there's the impeachment question, which is always lurking in the background with Trump. If Trump does deploy active duty troops to Minnesota, if there's a violent confrontation, if the courts rule that he acted unconstitutionally, some Democrats are definitely going to call for impeachment. They'll argue that using military force to override a state government's legitimate efforts to protect its residents is an abuse of power, that it's a violation of his oath to faithfully execute the laws and preserve the Constitution, and that it meets the standard of high crimes and misdemeanors. But we've been through this before. Trump was impeached twice during his first term, and both times he was acquitted by the Senate because Republicans stood by him. So even if the House were to impeach him again over this Minnesota situation, it's very unlikely the Senate would convict, because that would require 2/3 of the Senate to vote for conviction. And you're not going to get that many Republicans to vote to remove a president from their own party unless the evidence is absolutely overwhelming and the political pressure is unbearable. So impeachment is probably not going to be a realistic check on Trump's behavior here. It's more of a symbolic gesture, a way for Democrats to say, this is unacceptable, but not something that's actually going to result in him being removed from office or being held accountable in any meaningful way. Now let's think about the military itself, because there's a really important question here about what the military's role is and how military leaders are going to respond if they're ordered to deploy troops to Minnesota or if they're asked to federalize the National Guard in this situation. Military leaders, both active duty and retired, have been increasingly vocal in the last few years about their concerns with Trump's approach to using the military for domestic purposes. There was a huge controversy in Trump's first term when he wanted to deploy active duty troops to deal with protests after George Floyd's murder, and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs at the time, General Mark Milley, later said he regretted participating in that situation and that the military should not be used for domestic political purposes. Since then, there's been a lot of discussion within the military about civil-military relations, about the proper role of the military in a democracy, and about what military leaders should do if they receive orders they believe are unlawful or inappropriate. If Trump orders the deployment of active duty troops to Minnesota, there's a real question of whether military leaders will comply without pushback, or whether they will raise concerns, either privately with the president or publicly. The military has a strong tradition of civilian control, which means that military leaders are supposed to follow orders from the president, even if they disagree with those orders, as long as the orders are lawful. But if military leaders believe that deploying troops to Minnesota is unlawful, if they believe it violates the Posse Comitatus Act or the Insurrection Act or some other statute, then they have not just the right, but the duty to say so, to push back, and potentially even to refuse to carry out the order. That would be an extraordinary step, and it would create a massive crisis of its own. Because you'd have the president giving an order, and the military saying, no, we're not going to do it. But it's not out of the question, especially if the legal basis for the deployment is shaky, and if there's a sense within the military that this is being done for political reasons rather than for legitimate national security or law enforcement reasons. And even if the military does deploy to Minnesota, there's the question of what the troops on the ground are actually going to do. Are they going to be told to assist ICE in conducting raids? Are they going to be told to secure areas and prevent the National Guard from interfering? Are they going to be told to detain National Guard members if they try to block federal agents? These are questions that don't have clear answers, and they put individual soldiers and officers in incredibly difficult positions. If you're a soldier deployed to Minnesota and you're ordered to physically remove National Guard troops who are blocking an ICE raid, what do? Those Guard members are fellow Americans, they're fellow service members, they're not the enemy. And you're being asked to use force against them just so that immigration agents can arrest undocumented immigrants. That's a morally complicated situation, and it's the kind of thing that can create serious morale and discipline problems within the military. You could see soldiers refusing orders, you could see resignations, you could see protests from military families and veterans organizations, and all of that would add another layer of chaos and crisis to an already incredibly volatile situation. So here's the bottom line. We are watching a constitutional crisis unfold in Minnesota, and it has the potential to fundamentally reshape the balance of power between the federal government and the states, to redefine the limits of presidential authority, and to test American institutions in ways they haven't been tested in decades. The Trump administration is determined to enforce federal immigration law in sanctuary jurisdictions, and they're willing to use military force if necessary to overcome state resistance. Minnesota is determined to protect its residents from what it sees as unconstitutional federal overreach, and the governor has authorized the National Guard to physically block ICE if necessary. Both sides are dug in, neither side is willing to back down, and we are now just days away from a potential confrontation between armed state and federal forces on American soil. The legal questions are complex, the political stakes are enormous, and the potential for violence and chaos is very real. If the federal government wins this fight, it sets a precedent that the president can federalize state guards or deploy federal troops to override state governments whenever the president decides it's necessary. And that's a massive expansion of executive power that could be abused in all kinds of ways in the future. If Minnesota wins, it sets a precedent that states have real power to resist federal actions they believe are unconstitutional. And that could lead to a patchwork of state resistance movements across the country, with different states enforcing federal law in different ways or not at all. Either outcome is deeply troubling for the future of American federalism and democracy. And beyond the legal and constitutional questions, there's the human reality of what's happening on the ground. We're talking about communities in fear, families being torn apart, people who have lived in America for decades being arrested and deported, all in the name of enforcing immigration law. Whether you think that's necessary and justified, or whether you think it's cruel and inhumane, depends on your values and your view of immigration policy. But what should be clear to everyone is that the way this is being done, with threats of military force, with state and federal governments on a collision course, with the potential for violence and bloodshed, this is not how a functioning democracy should operate. This is the kind of thing that happens in authoritarian regimes or in countries that are falling apart, not in the United States of America. And yet here we are in 2026, watching as the president threatens to deploy troops against a state government, and watching as a state governor authorizes his National Guard to resist federal law enforcement. It's surreal, it's terrifying, and it's a sign of just how broken our political system has become. This story's far from over. Over the next few days, we're going to see whether ICE actually moves forward with these operations, whether the National Guard actually blocks them, whether Trump follows through on his threat to federalize the Guard or deploy federal troops, and whether the courts step in to try to resolve this before it turns violent. Keep your eyes on Minnesota, watch what the administration does, watch what the courts say, and watch how other states and cities respond. Because what happens in Minnesota is going to define American federalism and executive power for a generation. And it's going to have enormous implications for the 2026 midterms, for the rest of Trump's presidency, and for the future of American democracy. This is one of those moments where history is being made in real time, and we all need to pay very close attention to what happens next. Make sure you're subscribed to this channel so you don't miss any updates on this developing crisis, because things are moving fast, and the next few days could be absolutely pivotal for the future of this country.